We are here in my sewing corner today, which means, of course, we are making a project. This is one of my favorite dress patterns, but I do not believe I have ever made it on camera. This is Simplicity 2119 from 1947. This is a really fantastic day dress that has a lot of features I really like, such as a cute ruffled sleeve, a nice square neckline, pockets, shirt dress, all that good stuff. I love this pattern. I've made this pattern so many times, and by that I just mean two, I guess, but this will be my third time making it. When I make this dress, which again I am wearing kind of a weird mix, I did a sleeveless version, square neckline. You can really mix and match your pattern views. You see 2 views in a pattern, but usually you can get like 4 or 5 views out of a pattern. And I have also made the one with the ruffles, which is one of my favorites, and that is what we're going to create today. I unfortunately grew out of it, so as a result, I want to make another one because this is one of my go-to lounging about the house dresses. I also feel really great when I get to go out in this dress, so it's like a great multi-purpose dress for me. First is this fabric, which hopefully you can see, but it's this gorgeous. It has these hot pink cherries, blue raspberries, also hot pink raspberries. Like it's a really fun fabric. But last time I was up at Style Maker Fabric, I did look for bias binding because she has really, really fun bias binding options, and I found this great one to match it. So what we're gonna do is it'll be kind of a fun pattern mix of, I'll have this bias binding along the ruffle, along the neckline, and probably along the hemline as well. And this will be just like kind of like a fun detail. I will make the pockets deeper on this one. Let me show you actually on this dress here. These pockets aren't very deep. When I have my phone in this, it's not particularly sturdy, so I just want it to be like 2 inches deeper. This is like somewhere between a simple and a more complex project for me. Simple because I've made this pattern enough times that I know what I'm doing. A little bit more complicated because I am doing bias binding, which bias binding is something that I would say I'm not particularly skilled at. So it always takes a little bit of effort, but I think it's going to be a really fun dress. And because of how much I wear this dress and the dress before it, which I should put a picture in now that I'm thinking about it, that dress was my go-to dress for like 4 or 5 years. And like I said, when I had to declutter it because it no longer fit, I have just really missed having that dress because yeah, it was a good, reliable, faithful dress for me. I think it's always fun to make gowns and really special pieces on my channel, but I also think it's really important to show you guys me making stuff that I wear day to day. And yeah, I know once I make up this dress, I'll love it and I will wear it a lot. But yeah, let's just go ahead and hop right into it. First, I am going to cut this out. No alterations really needed here, although I do need it to be bigger, kind of across the board. So I'm going to add an extra 3/4 of an inch just to the side seam. Technically at this point I should be moving all of my seams over and spreading it evenly, but I don't feel like it, so I'm not going to. And then I'm just marking everything, cutting everything, working it all like normal. There was like a big die issue on this, so I made sure to cut one of my pieces with an edge on the die thing as opposed to like right in the middle of the dress. Everything here pretty straightforward, lots of marking, all of that good stuff. And as a reminder, I do have a Patreon and a Ko-fi. On my Patreon, you can go and support me monthly and you get access to my videos on Monday instead of Friday, as well as additional polls. And with my Ko-fi, you can just buy me a coffee one time. I always really appreciate the support over there because I spend a lot of money to run this channel and time, a lot of time. I decided to start by knocking out something easy, so I am sewing up the back skirt panels. Everything's really straightforward here, and I'm going to be pinking my seams for my seam finishing here. This is my preference when I use a vintage cotton because they are tightly woven enough that a pinking is really all they need. One of the things that I've found I like to do additionally with the bias tape is actually do the pocket top. So I cut the pockets a little bit differently. That way I could just top them with bias. I think it adds a cute little detail and an emphasis to the pockets. And here I'm just matching up the pockets to all of the markings. The other thing I will note is I made these pockets about 2 inches deeper than the ones with the original pattern because the original pattern doesn't really hold a modern cell phone well. I know, super shocking that a pattern from the 1940s didn't take into consideration my iPhone. Since they didn't, I had to make some alterations because yeah, I like to have a lot in my pockets. And then once the pockets are sewn on, I can then sew up the front skirt seams, and here I am just pressing those guys open. And at this point, I also decided to press my fold line. It is just always really helpful to have that fold line pressed in and super, super clear from the get-go. And now I'm turning my attention to the top. I am going to do some darts. I just didn't feel like doing this right off the bat. These aren't my favorite thing to do. So yeah, I wanted to get some easy wins that were fun. And now we are focusing on darts. I have 2 on the upper neckline, 2 on the back around the waist. And then the front actually features a couple tucks instead of darts, which I actually prefer the way a tuck looks. I think it's a lot softer of a bust shaper than a dart is. And then I get to press all these bad boys. Pretty easy and straightforward. The biggest thing to know is with a pleat like this, you actually press it like a box pleat. And then here I'm also going to put in my fold line, so that way when I go to sew the bodice to the skirt, I know where everything should be. Which here I am actually sewing the bodice to the skirt part. I'm doing this in 3 pieces. If you recall from watching some of my other videos, my preference in actually putting together a pattern is to do the side seams last. That way they are the most adjustable possible, so they're really easy for me to tighten up or loosen up depending on what I need, or I guess throw in a gusset if that's what I need as well. So that is why I'm doing things in this order, even though I will tell you this pattern tells you not to do it. The pattern I'm betting tells you to do a bodice and then make the skirt, then attach the 2. But yeah, this is a way for me to get a sustainable longer term thing that I can alter easy. And the more you alter your own clothing, the more you plan to alter your own clothing, so that way it's a little bit less painful. And with these 2 pieces, I can now throw in some interfacing. I'm just interfacing along the buttonholes and then obviously where the buttons will be mounted as well. I did not do this with a past dress and I deeply regretted it because I do feel like the buttons are actually, like, one of the buttons on the dress that I'm wearing is actually like tearing, and I just think the buttons really need that reinforcement of the additional interfacing. And then I am putting in the buttonholes as well at this time. I like to do my buttonholes when my pieces are still fairly separate and flat. Figured I'd throw this out there in case other people have had this issue. I'm having an issue that the buttonholes on the top side aren't looking nice anymore and the underside is what's looking great. And typically my buttonhole foot is not like that. Typically the top looks better, and I know it's something to do with the tension, but if you have any tips or have had this happen with your machine, let me know, because I am debating bringing my machine into the shop, because ever since there was some real quick work I had to do on my machine to keep it running during a project, and ever since then it hasn't really been the same. So if you have any tips on figuring out what's going on here, let me know. I am about to sew on some buttons. So while I sew the buttons on, we are over here for, of course, media on my mind. I just talk about what media I am taking in, sometimes to inform, sometimes to distract. This round of media is definitely not escapism. It is the opposite. It is definitely learning more about all the various injustices happening, both in the US and around the world, both in the past, present, and the past. So yeah, I accidentally have been taking in a lot of depressing media. I still want to talk about it because I have really enjoyed the media I've been consuming. I think it's all very well put together. But yes, definitely not on the not depressing front. First one that I'm going to talk about is The Alabama Solution. This is a documentary about prisons in Alabama and all the various abuses, as well as the way that slavery just evolved instead of going completely away. They talk about the use of essentially forced labor across the board in Alabama and how they have prisoners who literally go to jobs daily but are deemed too dangerous to release. And I think it's important to bring light on this problem. It's very important to talk about how the institution of slavery still exists for today. And what I really loved about this particular documentary is it was a story told by the prisoners themselves through footage that they smuggled out. I think it's important that when we tell people's stories, we include them in telling their stories. And often stories about prison do not include talking with the victims of prison. So I really thoroughly enjoyed this documentary for that reason. I will say I cried at the end. The end was so depressing. So yes, this is not a light thing, but I do think, again, it's really important to know and be able to speak to what's still happening in America, because a lot of people believe slavery was abolished, and it was technically abolished, but it has transformed into something else with the way our prisons are run today. Also, the fact that these private prisons are like literally profiting off of imprisoning so many people is so disgusting. So yeah, definitely not an escapist. Like I said, none of these books or documentaries are escapism, but I do think they're all really important. The next one that I'll talk about is Trust Me, The False Prophet. And this is about a woman and her husband who go kind of undercover with a cult leader after Jeff Warren, I believe, was arrested and put in prison for child abuse and child SA, and talked about one of the false prophets that popped up afterwards and continued similar cycles of abuse, and how this woman, through her doggedness because of her own experience with a false prophet, helped build the case against him and get him arrested and put in prison. Again, very depressing subject. However, I will say the woman who is the star of the documentary has just a light through her that is nice to see from someone who's been through something so horrific. It's a really compelling documentary that I highly recommend. Clearly, her and her husband are both very talented and smart. And I love, again, they talk to the women who are impacted by this, and we get to hear from them, which again, like I said, is really important when you tell stories like this. And I guess I will say this one had a happy-ish ending. Still, you know, not a happy ending, because it's terrible that this happened to women and children. Kind of important documentary. I don't think it's like a must-see, but I will say I thought it was very, very compelling. And the last depressing documentary on this list is The Predator of Seville. This documentary covers how a woman who was SA'd by a tour guide in college helped basically bring him down and bring him to justice. Also a very compelling documentary. I cried a lot at the end. I watched this back to back with the one that I just mentioned, and there's just so many common themes through both of these documentaries, and I have to say, like, the thing that sits with me the most is how women have to fight so hard to get justice because the system is not in our favor, and I hate that there's so many different ways that women fall prey to predators. It's overall, you know, a depressing outlook on the world to watch these two back to back, and how, yeah, it's women who have to say enough, and they have to devote basically their entire lives to get things like this to stop, and there's something also really upsetting about that. When we talk about like men and allyship, that is the type of ally energy I'd love to see from a man. Is I'd love to see him take something like this on and do a lot of the labor that you see women doing all the time to try to bring predators to justice. And like both of these documentaries, they like remind me of like what's going on with the Epstein files. Like these just were like I said, depressing watch. I think I cried in both of them, actually. I also cried at the Alabama Solution. So I guess what I'm going to say is every single one of these medias have made me cry, because I'm about to talk about two books that also made me cry. So yeah, I guess I'm in my depressing media era. However, I learned things through these documentaries, and I think they are both stories that are really important to tell. I wish the world was not such a predatory place for women and children. Pivoting to some depressing books, I finally read Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is my first of her books. People have always said I should read her, but I have usually just not been in a space where I can read something that depressing. Kindred is one that I've had just tons of people recommend to me. I think I've had people here recommend it to me. I've had people in my personal life recommend it to me. When I talk to people at bars, they've recommended it to me. Like, this is a book that gets recommended to me so much, and I read it, and like, I will say, very depressing book. However, I love historical fiction that's mixed with science fiction in this way, and I will say what an absolutely compelling writer Octavia Butler is. I would like to, I think, read all of her books, her whole catalog. I just think I have to do it a bit slowly, because I think I need to slow my roll for a second on depressing media. I would like to read more of her books, because I don't think I have been unable to put a book down like I was this book for a very long time. This was a book that I was staying up too late to read and finish, and I couldn't stop reading. It was so compelling, so well written. I was so invested in all of the characters and their growth lines, and like, it was such a good read, and I can't wait to read more of her work. Probably once summer is here, which we're close. I thoroughly enjoyed, but yes, I needed a little bit of a break from depressing reads before I take on more of her work. And the reason I chose Kindred to read too from her is it talks about the past, and the past is really awful, but I don't know if I can read her two books that are supposed to mirror what's happening now that were written in the past. With everything going on, I think that's going to be a pretty tough read, and the past is tough as well, but it's different than like the present that I'm living through. I can't wait to read more of her work. I need to look at probably her whole catalog, see what interests me next, and maybe what one of her maybe less depressing books are. If you have a recommendation from her catalog, give it to me. I'm already aware of both of her parables, so I will read those eventually. I just, again, different headspace, maybe different time in history is needed for me to read those. I also read Homecoming, which is a book that follows, I can't remember if it's 6 or 8 generations of people who originate from Africa. Some become African Americans through the slave trade. Again, a pretty depressing book, but I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed the form of the book. I really enjoyed it. Was basically a ton of short stories going through each generation, and I loved being able to read just one short story when I went to bed, having kind of like an easy limit on it. I found all of the characters so interesting to read about, as well as their places in time and history. Again, lots of depressing stuff in this book, so again, not a light read. I loved being able to see people like reappear in other people's stories as it went through the generations. Actually, it's interesting because this book really clearly connects to the Alabama solution, because it talks about prison labor and some of the origins of prison labor right after slavery ended. And I don't know that I knew that much about what happened after slavery ended that started this prison slavery movement, and so I definitely learned more about that, and I have a part in history for me to read more about that on. I also learned more about African history as well, so I really enjoyed that. I learned more about their languages and their legends and their culture. So yeah, this was like a highly recommend book. I would maybe even say must read, because yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. That is all of the media I have been ingesting lately. I feel like I am feeling a little bit more upset and depressed with what's going on in the world than usual. Don't get me wrong, I always feel that way, but I don't think all this media that I've ingested has necessarily helped. But like I said, I learned a lot. I do enjoy learning, even when it's about horrible things in history. However, like I said, I'm gonna real quick start diving into some lighter things because, yep, it was a bit tough. And I definitely recommend going into these with a very specific headspace and being very intentional. I recommend all of these pieces of media. I think all of them were special in their own way. But yes, I am looking to find more sapphic romance in my future to take a little bit of a break from reality and the world we live in today. But yes, I am going to continue. I only got 3 of, I think I have 6 buttons left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I'm actually going to catch you tomorrow. I have drinks with a friend tonight. And then I'm going to go to the farmer's market tomorrow morning. So I will catch you after all of that good stuff. I also am now applying Fray Check. I now use Fray Check for all of my buttonholes. I think it adds to sturdiness and wear, and as I always say, I am making clothing for it to last a long time. I would like this dress to by far outlive me, if it is possible at all, and I think using these steps like Fray Check really help with that longevity. And now with everything done as far as I can get it, while these pieces are flat, it's now finally time to start to attach them. I'm going to start first attach them to the shoulder, because I'm going to get the neckline all wrapped up before I do all of those side seams. I've already sewn on the bias binding, and I did have to look up a tutorial to figure out how to do those corners. And then here I am just stitching the very ends, so that way we'll have a nice neat end. I worked really hard on this bias binding, because in the past when I've made this dress, the bias binding has been the part that I haven't loved about it because of how sloppily I've done it. So working really hard to try to make it all look a lot better this round. And then here I am actually pinking and trimming that bias binding. I find that bias binding lays a lot nicer when what's under it is less thick. So I have learned that it's just best to trim, and I always trim using my pinking shears because I feel like the jagged ends help not have that kind of hard seam line that can happen if you do it with just regular scissors. And before I top stitch the bias binding, I am pressing everything, making sure the bias binding is covering up the stitch line, and I am actually going to top stitch from the front instead of the back. I used to do the back, but I've learned that the front is the way to go for the neatest looking bias binding, which I am running through here, and I am changing out my thread for this step especially, but for all bias binding steps, which is a bummer, but if you're going to use a really contrast bias binding, that is ultimately what ends up happening. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing to run the bias binding along the edge of the sleeve ruffles. This is another thing the pattern doesn't call for, but if I'm going to do bias binding, I like for it to go lots of spots, especially when it's such a cute contrasty one like this. I don't know why, but pressing this one was particularly satisfying. sewing. I think it's because it was so flat and I didn't have to like turn any corners, so it wasn't stressful at all. And it took some hard thinking on exactly how I was gonna sew up the middle so that way the edge ruffle didn't have like raw edges showing on it, and I did figure it out. But yeah, it took a lot of figuring out, which I think that's one of my favorite parts of sewing, is how much thought you have to put in to do something as simple as not having raw edges poking out on your ruffle and getting them all contained. There's just fun things like that about sewing that really use your brain. And now I get to run all of these gathering stitches through the arm ruffles. These are actually ruffled all the way around, unlike a traditional sleeve. So I will be running gathering stitches all the way around this ruffle. But for some unexplainable reason, I kept procrastinating sewing up the side seams, so that is what I'm going to be doing here, as well as cutting open my buttonholes after that before I put the ruffles on, just to try it on and make sure everything fits and looks right. And now I can no longer procrastinate any longer, and I am going to get these ruffles going. Just easing them around. I don't know why this felt like such a monumental task on this project, but I did everything I could to delay it, and then once I did it, I was like, that was so easy. I don't know why I did that, but neurodivergency is fun in that way. And I would normally just pink this part, except for the fact that I know you're going to be able to see it because of the way the armholes work. So I did go ahead and use just a rayon hem tape to cover up the edges of the sleeve head. And with another try-on, I'm now going to put in the hooks and eye. Also, I'm just doing everything I can. I had to order more bias tape for the hem, so I'm just getting everything done except for the hem because I have to wait for my delivery of the bias binding, which I'll make sure to link in this video. I am also sewing in my label using the two little neck darts to kind of hang it in between. I haven't done that before, so I figured I'd throw it out there. That way I could not have the thread on the front, but I would still have my label anchored. And finally, the bias binding has come in, and I have a intentful watcher. She has been very quiet this video, so it's good to see her pop in for a bit. Even though this is flat and straightforward, I still find it best to trim down the inside to again just have the best looking press on my bias binding here. And what I also didn't show is first I press everything down into the bias binding before I then press it up. Honestly, bias binding to look its best is a lot of really tedious pressing, which is not my favorite, but it is worth it. And if you're gonna take the time to do it, it is worth doing correctly. Or I don't know if this is technically correctly, but it's worth doing in a way that it's going to look super nice. But with no curves or anything, this was a really nice one to just run my stitches through. And for the finishing touch, I actually decided to make a belt. I had just enough of the bias binding left. So I am excited to do that because I felt like a belt would just be a nice little detail. And with that, we are ready for the reveal. Alright, you have seen the reveal. I hope you enjoyed. I went to one of my favorite spots in the whole wide world. Unfortunately, they seem to be starting to phase out all the bluebells, which, to be fair, they are invasive. They aren't great, but they're so pretty, and so I'm a little bit bummed because they're putting in lawn. It would be one thing if they were like trying to landscape with other flowers, but lawn, really? But I will still enjoy it while it is still there, and it is mostly still there this spring. We are going to continue by doing my usual budget breakdown, project wrap-up, and Hope Helps series, so let's hop into it. I have my budget sheet here, and I'm quite pleased with this one. So the fabric, I bought this fabric like 5 years ago. Like, this is a pretty OG To Me Sewing fabric, and I bought it for $41.97, which honestly isn't too shabby. That comes out to, it's a little bit less than $10 a yard. For vintage fabric, it's not terrible, especially such a novelty print. Notions, we are a little bit more expensive on notions on this project because I did need 8 yards of that bias tape. And one of those I had to ship in, which added to the expense because I actually add the shipping expense to the cost of goods like proportionately. I spent $23.13 on all of the notions, buttons, threads. This includes pretty much everything. And then as far as the pattern comes pretty cheap because this is my third time using it. So it was $5.87. I take the total of the pattern and I divide it by the number of times I've used it, and I've used this pattern quite a bit. So that brings me to a supply total of $70.87. I'm pretty happy with spending that on a dress, especially a dress that I know I'm going to get as much wear as I will out of this guy. But with that, we're going to pivot over to labor. I am using the cost of labor in Seattle for a living wage, which is not a surviving wage, which is the minimum you need to survive, but has a little growth in the wage for things like hobbies, quality of life stuff. I believe with how much companies are making in profits, we should be having livable and enjoyable lives as workers. So that means that the rate is $51 per hour for that in Seattle. I am planning on over the next few weeks to months doing a price about LA and New York because those are the two biggest clothing manufacturers. I want to say Charlotte is maybe somewhere in there too. You would think that garment manufacturing happens in cheaper cities in Seattle, but with LA and New York being the most common, it is actually usually where the fashion scene is located, because one of the points of doing manufacturing in the US is having access to the manufacturers without having to step on an airplane. So I think it would be interesting to talk about what a living wage for a garment worker would look like in those two cities. And I will still look at if there's anywhere else in the US that would be interesting. All that to say, I hear you all on not always talking about a Seattle living wage, and I do plan on moving it around. It just takes a lot of extra work because I want to feel good about my numbers, which actually takes quite a bit of research. That said, making this dress was a little bit more labor intensive than I anticipated, and I think that's just due to all of the bias binding. I spent an hour and 15 minutes cutting it, 6 hours and 15 minutes sewing it, and then an hour and 15 minutes doing just the hand sewing work, so like adding the buttons. So that brings us to a labor total of 8 hours and 45 minutes, which I will multiply by a living wage here in Seattle, which is $51, which brings you to a labor cost total of $446.25. This brings the garment that I would have to sell for $517.22 to make a living wage for myself. That does not include profit, which in most cases companies mark things up anywhere from 30 to 80% to make profits on, depends on the company. So when you buy that dress for even just $40, you have to think about what is really going back to the worker, and the answer is not much. And we're not just talking about an individual worker. Of course, these are made in factories. It also includes the like fabric manufacturers. It includes the warehouse workers, or even the retail assistant that you interact with in the store. All of that labor has to be accounted for in that $40 price tag, and I think we have to all look at, is there any way that that's a living wage? And the answer is definitely no. That is it on the labor and cost for this dress. Like I said, I'm pretty happy with that for my budget. I think this was a good thing for me for sure. And the dress itself is so cute. I am so proud of this dress. I absolutely love it. I've worn it. I get compliments on it. I don't know that I'll always wear it with a belt, but the belt is nice to have. And I was curious, so I didn't usually I put a hook and eye at the very end of the belt, just so there's something to keep it from like popping off. And I didn't do that with this belt, and so far so good. So we're gonna keep it that way until the day it pops off. I think all of the bias tape is what makes this dress super special. Every time I've made it, I've used a ton of bias tape. Yeah, I think the bias tape is what makes it so special, and it's really nice. This one, I used a higher quality bias tape, which definitely worthwhile. Definitely recommend Style Makers bias tapes. They're super great. I think it just turned out so cute, and I know I'm gonna wear this a ton. This is a dress that I wear and I don't think about. The only thing I sometimes think about is if the ruffle decides to go like this, which really only happens when I pull off a jacket. Otherwise, it's pretty good at staying this way. And I don't know, did I make any mistakes? Honestly, this dress is a tried and true for me, so I didn't really mess it up. I've made this dress. This is my third time making it, and it's like a lot easier when you make one. Like, what I will say is that like it's just is infinitely easier to make a dress for the gajillionth time than it is to make a new pattern each time. So it was fun to revisit this pattern. I will say very satisfied with how deep these pockets are. I can fit so much in these pockets. So yeah, I see this being like an absolute summer staple for me. And I don't know that I honestly have any other thoughts. Oh, other than I did it. I feel like I've finally, I wouldn't say mastered the art of making a belt, but I finally can consistently have a belt that I like when I make a belt to go with a garment. So that's a big win. Any of you who've been around my channel for forever knows that belting has always been a little bit of a struggle for me. But that's kind of all my thoughts on the project. This one, like I said, was really straightforward and was like visiting an old friend. I will also say I think my quality in bias binding has gone significantly up. Some of it is I just know a lot more tricks. I'm also a little bit less stubborn about Googling what I don't know. Like I definitely had to Google how to do like the interior corners, but all of that was good. I learned a lot and it was a lot easier than I even remembered it previously. But with that, we're going into Hope Helps. This round, we are talking about the news and the things in the news that are making me helpful. And I have just kind of some trends and changes that I'm seeing. And I feel like I am talking about this topic a lot, but we are talking about voting today to start. One of the biggest things I feel like I hear from people in despair is that we're not even going to vote for the presidential election. So in 3 years in 2028. I guess that's that's like 2 years away. Ugh. I mean, it's been speeding by and going so slow at the same time. But yeah, people are like, you can't vote your way out of this. We're going to lose the right to vote. All that stuff. You hear all of this like really spiraling propaganda. I've been hearing it from like even people who I care about personally in my life, like my friends. And I feel like I just want to real quick say they're wrong, right? One of the big news items is Hungary's dictator was actually voted out of office. You can successfully vote a dictator and a fascist out of office. It is doable. So that's like some international voting news. That's a big win and good like intro to the theme. The rest of this theme, I'm going to talk about voting in the US. Trump and the Republican Party have been working to access and disenfranchise voting for people by doing things like accessing rolls, forcing people off voting rolls. Just kind of, they're up to all of their usual shenanigans. The Republican Party is pretty notorious for trying to take away people's right to vote. So with that, there was the 5th lawsuit that stopped the Republican administration from getting access to the voter rolls in Rhode Island. This follows 4 other cases that he was not allowed to get access to them. And by that, I mean the Republican Party. Let's be real, Trump doesn't have enough of a brain to care about the voting rolls. And then Virginia agreed, and by agreed, I mean I think was semi-forced into not forcing voters off of their rosters. So all of this is really important when it comes to talking about democracy. We are not losing our right to vote. We will be voting, and you can vote out a dictator. Kind of on that, not only can we vote, but we can put pressure on our senators, our local people, like across the board. I want to talk about something that personally warmed my heart is strong because it's such bare minimum action. But in my state, we have, I was gonna say 2 senators. That's true for all states. That's why they're senators and not House of Representatives. But in my state, our 2 senators are pretty squarely corporate Democrat, not unlike Nancy Pelosi. And it has been very challenging to get them to vote to not send arms to Israel, to get them to admit that a genocide is happening to Palestinians over there. It has been really frustrating. I personally have held like letter writing campaigns and stuff to our senators because I'm so brokenhearted on what is happening to the Palestinian people. And I know we're not the party in power, but Democrats have typically backed Israel just as much as Republicans. So in my opinion, they are equally as guilty and have blood on their hands. I always say, don't drunk dial your ex, drunk dial your senator. I am somebody who, if I get a little tipsy off a little bit of wine and I feel like I need some space, I actually drunk dial my senators, and I usually talk about Palestinians. Not always. A lot of issues are on the table, and I try to use the self-destruction desire to call your ex and ruin your life to instead be a bit more constructive. So that is something I do often, and I am very pleased because both Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell, which I didn't even get into her, she sucks. Maria Cantwell is the worst. I really hope we are going to vote her out and primary her here in the state because the worst. She's the absolute worst. But they actually voted with Bernie on stopping putting in bulldozers and bombs to Israel to commit genocide on the Palestinians. Of course, both of them still released their weirdly pro-Israel statements despite this. However, this is a big move. I never thought Maria Cantwell, who has taken tons of money from AIPAC, would ever vote against sending arms to Israel. It just shows that you can move the needle. Clearly, she is worried about a primary challenge. So I just encourage people, stay involved in your democracy. Voting is not the end all be all. You should be doing more, but voting also really matters, and we need to stop fear-mongering voting. There are some real threats to voting, don't get me wrong, but we just need to be really intentional about where we speak to the threat on voting versus the actual real threats that are targeting marginalized folks here in America. We need to put our energy on that instead of like, I feel like because it's always white people that I hear talking about not getting to vote. It's never a marginalized group that I hear that from. It's always white people. So we need to stop focusing on that because white people will have the right to vote. It's also not even us being targeted in most cases. So we need to turn our eye and focus on marginalized voices and uplifting them. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video. You can find me here almost every Friday. I have lots of sewing content coming forward. I'm in a real Sojo Mojo type of vibe, so I'm definitely just puttering along here. As always, you can support me by commenting down below, giving me a thumbs up, subscribing if you haven't already. I think you like me, you're still here. And then of course I have my Patreon where you can support me financially. I pay to run this channel currently. While I am deeply passionate about running this channel, it does kind of suck that it loses me money. So I always appreciate support over there. You can also just buy me a one-time coffee on Ko-fi if you don't want to do the subscription, but you do want to chip in financially. But with that, I will see you guys next week for another sewing project. I can't wait for you to see it. I have it hanging in my shower right now and it's so good. So I will see you then. Bye!